Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel. And if you haven't been keeping track of War Thunder news, the developers just released a new set of proposed battle rating changes to rebalance some of the vehicles. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to run through exactly how balance works, elements like power creep, and even some parts of this battle rating change specifically, so feel free to follow along. The game in the background is actually my highest kill game in the game of War Thunder, and also a very close match in general, and features a lot of the French vehicles that are proposed to get nerfed with the next set of battle rating changes, so it'll give you some idea of how they perform in game, and also at least some bona fides for me when I start talking about whether or not they should be receiving these nerfs. Now this may be a bit of a hot take, but in order for a game to be engaging and fun to play, not all elements need to be perfectly balanced. In fact, some imbalance actually adds to the engagement factor. Trying to figure out your strengths and weaknesses and how they match up against the other person's strengths and weaknesses can obviously be a mini game in and of itself. The problem with balance comes when you have two elements that are basically the same, except one just has slightly worse stats, and in that instance you're just playing a worse version of what your opponent is playing. Now ideally this would have other balancing factors around it, such as cost, or you're playing a faction that has specific elements that the other person doesn't, and that's why your vehicle has an artificial nerf, something to that effect. But in general, it is important to remember that perfect balance isn't always the best possible solution, and you just want to get it close enough so that players feel like they have a reasonable chance of winning, that they can still be engaged with the experience. A recent hot button in the War Thunder community has been how badly the American top tier teams are performing. On average, they're only getting between a 30 and 40% win rate, while most other nations are doing perfectly fine. Obviously, this kind of imbalance is not exactly fun on either side of the equation. If you're on the American team, you know you're going to lose just by looking at the scoreboard and seeing that USA is on your side, or that you are playing USA. Conversely, on the other team, it's mostly just a kill race. Whether or not you're going to win the game is not exactly in question. So these type of balance problems should be addressed relatively quickly by developers. However, that's going to be the topic for the rest of the video, because it turns out it's actually a very complex issue. One of the first topics and a hot button for basically a lot of communities is power creep. Now, power creep goes hand in hand with accretion, and it's important to realize this. Accretion is when you add more things over time. The reason why power creep goes hand in hand with accretion is if you're constantly adding more things, you will inevitably add things that are more powerful than previous things. In and of itself, this doesn't necessarily lead to power creep, but it's important to remember that in games in particular, there is a phenomena in which players will gravitate towards the more powerful elements, so those will always be overrepresented when you play a match. In other words, you're going to see the top 5 best tanks in any given match, rather than just seeing a random selection of all available tanks. And if you saw a random selection of all available tanks, you might actually notice that the power level of the game as a whole hasn't changed, but the power levels of vehicles you see and experience in a match has. This also leads to an interesting discussion about exactly what power creep is, because power creep is the average power level you get for a given resource increasing over time. For example, in the Magic the Gathering game, Grizzly Bears used to be a really powerful card. 2 mana for a 2/2 was a great stat block early in the game's life cycle. However, at this point in the game, 2 mana for a 2/2, unless it has a really good ability, is not really worth playing on its own. In fact, 2 mana for less than a 2/2, you expect it to have an amazing ability. So Grizzly Bears has been entirely power crept from a very viable element to a very non-viable element, and that is an example of how power creep works. An example of something that is not power creep but is commonly confused as power creep is the meme that is commonly seen within the Hearthstone community of the Silverback Patriarch. The meme essentially goes that Blizzard keeps power creeping, quote unquote, the Silverback Patriarch by printing cards that are objectively better than it. The problem with this, and the reason why it's not power creep, is the Silverback Patriarch was never on curve. There has never been any point in Hearthstone's history where you wanted to pay 3 mana for a 1/4 with taunt. This card has always been bad. So making a playable version is not power creep, because this card was never part of the meta. It was never a commonly seen card. So making a version of it that actually sees play does not represent power creep on any level. Conversely, something like Dr. Boom that used to be the default drop and the best creature you could get for 7 mana, if you printed it today, would be basically unplayable. That is an example of power creep, because you're taking a one-time meta staple and making it basically unusable, because the amount of power you expect for that mana has gone up so significantly that it's just not worth playing. Now, looking at another online free-to-play MMO tank game, World of Tanks, we actually see a much bigger issue with power creep than you see with the card games, because the card games can use what's called set rotation, wherein not every set is legal at all times. So this can kind of sort of contain power creep, although it doesn't always work, but at least it helps with the accretion problem. In World of Tanks, you have 10 tiers of vehicles, and everything has to fit within that 10-tier format. So if you just keep adding vehicles to tier 8, tier 9, tier 10, whatever, eventually you're going to get new best vehicles, and those vehicles are going to be overrepresented in the matchmaker, and this in turn adjusts the power level up. And World of Tanks doesn't really play around with their power level in the way that some other games do. Generally speaking, a vehicle will stay at the same tier. If vehicles are significantly underperforming, or the devs don't feel they have a role where they're useful, they just kind of get retired, so you see them in the matchmaker even less, which doesn't help the power creep problem. Additionally, when new vehicles get updated, it's pretty rare to see major nerfs. Usually it's only for extreme problem vehicles, and more often it's buffs. However, the buff no nerf cycle that a lot of players like is actually not that healthy for a game, because it's just constant power creep. And by the time you get to the end of the buff cycle, now the cards that were at the beginning of the buff cycle, or the vehicles that were beginning of the buff cycle, are now completely irrelevant, because you've just gone through and buffed everything. And this is why the buff no nerf mentality that a lot of players have is just not viable. What the developers need to do is that developers need to come up with a baseline for power level that they are comfortable with, and they need to try to bring everything as close as possible to that baseline, rather than continuing to ramp everything up and up and up, because doing the latter will simply result in massive power creep issues. Now, War Thunder has a much more interesting approach to power creep and attrition than the tier system you have in World of Tanks. Instead, you have the battle rating system. Except the battle rating system aren't locked to specific numbers. They can just go up. They can add more of them if they need to, and if top tier starts getting too cluttered. And usually when they add a new battle rating and move a lot of the highest stuff up, you also get an accordion effect where a lot of the lower stuff goes up as well to try and meet it. So what this actually does is it decompresses, as the term is commonly used by the War Thunder community, and it puts a lot less pressure on battle ratings below it. To use some passive examples, previously 5.3 battle rating would have to fight the King Tiger Porsche. The King Tiger Porsche was a very tough enemy for most 5.3 vehicles, except now that's 6.7. So you could say the battle rating power level for 5.3 has actually gone down at this point. Similar statements could be said for the 6.7 battle rating, where you have the King Tiger Henschel and the King Tiger Porsche, because 6.7, a lot of their tougher enemies like the Leopard 2 or the BMP-1 got moved up in battle rating as well. Additionally, you can also look at other examples like the M1 Abrams. The M1 Abrams, the original model, was an absolute beast when it first came out. It was the best tank in the game. And then newer vehicles got added above it, and its matchmaking got worse, and it became a much worse vehicle, and you could argue that's power creep. But at this point in the game, the M1 Abrams is actually really good, because it turns out top tier moved far enough away from the Abrams that there was enough of a battle rating spread that now the Abrams actually fights enemies that it's pretty well suited to deal with, and it's actually a really good vehicle right now. So this kind of shows that power creep in War Thunder is not linear. It doesn't always behave in the way that people think it does, and using the term in War Thunder is at best a bit of a misnomer, and at worst is kind of misleading. That's not to say power creep within War Thunder isn't a thing. When you first add vehicles like infantry fighting vehicles, or you first add accessories like drones for scout vehicles, you have to put them somewhere, and usually the battle ratings you put them at, now that battle rating has a higher power level than it did previously. But it's important to remember it's simply adding vehicles at top tier, because top tier is kind of its own thing and it gets continually moved up in BR every few months. It's not really power creep, at least not in the truest sense. But of course, one issue that's become a bit of a hot button with the last round of battle rating changes proposed by the developers is that the power level of a vehicle can't exist in a vacuum. You have to take into account the players themselves, and the players themselves, whether or not they use vehicles or what vehicles they use, can have as much of an influence on that vehicle's power level as the vehicle's actual stats or performance characteristics. A big example: Germany, Russia, and USA tend to be the most common starter nations, so there are a much higher population of inexperienced players in those nations. They also tend to be the most popular nations in general, so they make up a big chunk of the matchmaker, which in turn gives these major nations a lot more data, and a lot more data that's at the low end of the skill scale that their vehicles are often balanced off of. And this of course leads us to France. pretty much nobody goes into a tank game and says, man, I want to play French tanks. Typically the people going to play France are people that already have one or even two other nations under their belt, and rank 1 France is probably the single worst experience in the game of War Thunder. So by the time you get to the mid and high tiers of France, usually you're looking at a pretty good average player. In fact, in my experience, the French teams are some of the best you can get in the entire game. Most people on a French team know what they're doing. However, this also means that French vehicles have artificially inflated performance characteristics because people that have good map awareness, that know where to aim, that know how to position themselves are using these vehicles more often than somebody who just has no idea how the game works. Now, the developers could theoretically try to control for this by adding rules to their dataset that tries to weight data based on the number of vehicles a person has in general and the number of vehicles in the nation a person has. However, they're probably not going to do it because they are monetarily disincentivized from doing so, and this is where we get to the thorny topic of how premium vehicles are balanced. Every vehicle in War Thunder is balanced based off of its performance characteristics. The problem is premium vehicles, unlike a lot of tech tree vehicles of an equivalent battle rating, anybody can just buy and play, even somebody who has no idea what they're doing. This means that premium vehicles often get artificially deflated performance characteristics that results in them having battle ratings that are at best kind of questionable. And of course, if you're the developers, putting rules into your dataset to make these premium vehicles more balanced is obviously not something that you are financially incentivized to do, because it just makes these vehicles that people pay money for less desirable. But now it's time for the Count of Monte Cristo twist in our tale, because it turns out if you're not balancing a vehicle for the people that are playing that vehicle, who are you even balancing that vehicle for? This is a problem that a lot of development teams face, because a weapon or a card or a vehicle that is balanced for the lowest tier of play isn't necessarily balanced for the average tier of play or the highest tier of play. So which one of these do you focus on? And War Thunder chooses to focus on the average person that's actually playing it, and it's hard to say that that is a definitively wrong call. To use an example, a lot of people know the Tiger tank, so a lot of people that don't know much about tanks, when they boot up War Thunder, they're probably going to go for the Tiger tank, or the Tiger 1, Tiger 2, Panther. These are all very popular tanks. People like them, people think they're cool. But this also leads to a lot of really bad players playing them. So do you balance it for the average person in the matchmaker playing the Tiger, or do you balance it for that one person that has 10,000 hours and picks up a Tiger? You probably balance it for the average person. Sure, the one person that has a lot of hours in the Tiger and can absolutely decimate a team is a problem, but most Tiger players have incredibly poor awareness. They don't really know where to aim against enemies that have complex armor profiles, and their map positioning in general is just not very good. So on the whole, it's not really destroying the matchmaker for the Tiger to beat its current battle rating, even though it probably is a little too good for where it's at right now. At the end of the day, there is no right or wrong answer in determining which end of the player's skill scale that you are balancing your game for, but you do have to remember, both as a developer and a player, a game perfectly balanced for competitive play isn't necessarily suited for casual play, and vice versa. So it is important to remember that these can be mutually exclusive. Balance is not a singular thing, it exists across a wide spectrum of ways that you play a game. Wrapping back around to the specific set of battle rating changes proposed, I don't feel the 7-7 France lineup moving almost entirely to 8.0 is all that necessary. In a max down tier to 6.7, they were incredibly effective. However, in a max up tier to 8.7, they were fairly weak. And moving them up to 8.0, where they can see 8.7 and 8.7 tanks without it being a max up tier, so you could theoretically see an entire team of seeing things like a T55 AM1 or an M60 Rise P, really puts a lot of these tanks in an awkward spot. The Char 25T in particular is going to be hurting a lot, because the Char 25T has a shell that only has a maximum penetration of 209mm. Even its own battle rating, it can struggle to hurt a lot of the heavier Russian tanks you can run into, and moving it up so that it fights more tougher opponents on a more regular basis probably isn't going to be doing it any favors. It's also important to note that a lot of these French vehicles don't have stabilizers, and a lot of them fire solid shot rounds, whereas now they could be fighting enemies with stabilizers, darts, laser rangefinders, and thermal imaging, and they just don't compete that well against those enemies at a lot of ranges. So on the whole, I think the developers could probably afford to keep all of these vehicles at 7.7. It's not like there's a huge population of French players that are ruining the matchmaker, so I don't necessarily agree with how many vehicles are getting moved up, because it's basically taking apart the entire French 7.7 lineup, which used to be one of the bigger reasons to play France. But that's just my thoughts on the subject. And that concludes our video. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun, hope you learned something. If you agree, please leave a comment. If you don't agree, please leave a comment. I always like to hear people who think that I'm completely off base on something. Anyway, hope you have a nice day. Danke bitte, tschüss.